All right, so are you ready to dive in? We've got a fascinating deep dive today. You've sent us a whole bunch of articles, and it looks like there's a lot of interest in this whole Donald Trump and the biblical prophecy thing. Specifically, these 7 signs that some folks think point to him being chosen by God for some special purpose. Now, before we go any further, I want to just make it crystal clear. We're not here to tell you what to believe or to endorse any particular viewpoint. Our goal is to just kind of unpack these 7 signs, see how they're being connected to Scripture, and give you the information you need so you can draw your own conclusions.
Yeah, it's really interesting, to see how these interpretations are kind of weaving current events together with those ancient texts, right? It's like they're creating a story that really clicks with certain believers. It's a window into how people try to find meaning, in a world that can feel pretty chaotic and unpredictable.
Exactly. So let's unpack these 7 signs. The first one, it's all about numbers, specifically the number 45. It's a bit of a coincidence, because Donald Trump is the 45th president of the United States, and Isaiah chapter 45 just happens to zero in on the story of Cyrus the Great.
And that's where things get interesting. Isaiah 45 lays out the story of Cyrus, this Persian king, who, get this, wasn't even a follower of the God of Israel, but was chosen by God to free the Israelites from, captivity in Babylon. He's portrayed as this unlikely hero, a tool of God, defying expectations and pulling off this monumental task.
So the parallel people are drawing here is that Trump, just like Cyrus, comes from this unconventional background, a businessman, not a politician, right? And rose to power without the usual support of the establishment, including some religious elites.
Right. And what's really striking is that the text doesn't paint Cyrus as super devout in the traditional sense. And that raises the question, right? Does someone need to be deeply religious to fulfill a divine purpose? It's a theme that keeps popping up in these Trump interpretations. It really challenges our assumptions about who God might consider worthy or chosen, All
right, so we've got this number 45 connection. The second sign takes us to a place that holds massive symbolic weight in the Bible, Jerusalem. And specifically, Trump's decision to move the U.S. embassy there, which, kind of bucked decades of precedent and stirred up controversy.
Yeah, and to really grasp why this resonates with some believers, we've got to dig into what Jerusalem represents biblically. It pops up over 800 times in the Bible, often described as the city God chose for himself. It carries this huge symbolic weight for the Jewish people as a symbol of their hope and covenant with God.
Now, for those who might not be super familiar with the Bible, can you just kind of give us a quick rundown on why Jerusalem is so central to these prophecies?
Sure thing. Jerusalem is intertwined with prophecies about the Messiah and what some call the end times. Books like Ezekiel and Revelation, for example, they have these vivid descriptions of a future Jerusalem, sometimes depicted as a renewed earthly city, sometimes as a heavenly city descending from God.
So for those who take these prophecies literally, recognizing Jerusalem as Israel's capital becomes way more than just a political move, right? It's seen as a concrete step toward fulfilling these grand prophetic visions.
Yeah, it feeds into this belief that we're in a pivotal time, that events are playing out according to some kind of divine schedule.
Okay, moving on to sign number 3, the Abraham Accords. These were those peace agreements between Israel and several Arab nations, all brokered by the Trump administration. It was a diplomatic move that caught a lot of people off guard.
And even the name Abraham Accords carries weight. It calls back to Abraham, considered the father of Israel, a patriarch of 3 major religions, right? Judaism, Christianity, and Islam. Bringing these nations together, even if it's temporary, seemed to some fulfilling this vision of unity that goes all the way back to the foundation of these faiths.
Right. And there's this idea floating around that prophecies about peace in the Middle East are like precursors to some major events in the biblical narrative. Is that right?
Absolutely. However, it's worth pointing out that some biblical passages also talk about turmoil, even destruction, after declarations of peace. So it's a more nuanced view, a bit of a warning amidst the optimism.
So even within these interpretations, there's this mix of hope and uncertainty. They acknowledge the complexity of these events and, what they might mean. Okay, now, sign number 4 takes a bit of a darker turn. After Trump lost the 2020 election, war broke out in Israel.
And this is where the prophecy in Zechariah 12 comes into play. It describes Jerusalem being under siege, becoming this immovable rock, facing attacks from every side, but ultimately holding strong.
I see. So some folks are directly linking this war to Trump being out of office. Like his absence kind of created a void,
Yeah.
and that allowed this conflict to erupt.
Yeah, it reinforces this idea that he had this specific role to play, divinely ordained, and that his absence has destabilized things, maybe even serving as a test of faith for God's chosen people, you know?
Okay, things are definitely getting intense. This is a lot to take in. Now, sign number 5. We're shifting gears to something more personal. Remember that incident at the rally in Pennsylvania where a bullet barely missed Trump?
Oh, yeah, that was immediately jumped on by those who believe in, you know, his divine protection. It evoked those biblical stories of people being shielded from harm, like David escaping King Saul or Daniel in the lion's den.
And the passage from Psalm 91 was going around online, right?
Right.
The one about God commanding his angels to guard you in all your ways.
Exactly. That verse became a focal point, solidifying the belief that Trump wasn't just spared for a reason, but that he was actively being protected by a higher power. You know, like he's got a mission he hasn't finished yet.
It's like the question shifted from how did he survive to why was he spared? And that why becomes this open invitation to interpret the event through, like, prophecy and divine intervention.
Totally. It fuels this idea that there's this bigger story unfolding and that even seemingly random, chaotic events can fit into that narrative.
All right, let's move on to sign number 6. This one's centered on Trump's stance on abortion. He was very vocal about pro-life policies, championing legislation, and putting conservative judges in place. Actions that really resonated with a big chunk of the Christian community.
This connection stems from the biblical view of life being sacred from the moment of conception, right? The belief that every life has inherent value and purpose from the very beginning. A concept often tied to Psalm 139, which describes God knitting a person together in the womb.
So for those already leaning towards seeing Trump in this, like, messianic light, his actions on this issue weren't just political choices. They were in line with this higher moral authority, a divine call to protect the unborn.
Right. It goes beyond policy debates and into this realm of spiritual warfare, a battle for the very souls of the innocent, as some see it.
Okay, we're at the final sign now, number 7. This one focuses on Trump's actions to, defend religious freedom. This covers a bunch of initiatives, from executive orders protecting religious organizations to vocal support for prayer in schools and aid to persecuted Christians around the world.
And these actions were seen by some as pushing back against, like, the secularization of society, reclaiming space for faith in the public sphere, aligning with those biblical teachings about being a light in the darkness and, standing up for truth.
It's like he was defying the norm, refusing to shy away from religious expression in a culture that often tries to keep faith private.
Yes, and that resonated with those who feel like their beliefs are under attack or being marginalized. It tapped into this sense that there's a spiritual battle going on and that Trump was on the front lines fighting for their right to, live out their faith openly and without fear.
So there we have it, the 7 signs. Everything from, like, numerical coincidences to political decisions and personal events, all woven together with biblical interpretations. It's creating a narrative that's clicking with a certain group of believers. But before we go any deeper into what this all means, we want to hear from you. What's standing out to you so far? What questions are popping up in your mind? We'll explore those and more. Well, just keep listening.
So welcome back. It's really kind of mind-blowing how these 7 signs, these seemingly random events, have been, like, woven together into this, pretty powerful story. And as we dig deeper, it's important to remember that we're not just talking about politics or, biblical interpretation. We're also looking at the psychology of belief, how people find meaning and make sense of the world,
Yeah, that's a really good point. It's easy to get caught up in the details of each sign, but we got to zoom out and consider the big picture. That human need to find patterns and stories, especially when things feel uncertain or out of our control.
Exactly. And these interpretations of Trump as, like, a divinely chosen figure, they tap into that deep need for meaning. It's about finding order in the chaos, a sense of purpose when the world feels random and unpredictable.
Okay, so let's talk about that need for meaning. How does it connect to the specific signs we've been talking about? Like, we talked about the whole Trump-Cyrus parallel, the idea that God can work through unconventional figures, even those who might not seem, outwardly religious or fit the traditional mold of a spiritual leader.
You see, it's this idea of the unlikely hero, that instrument of God who doesn't fit the mold, that really grabs people. It opens up this possibility that anyone, even someone with flaws or a controversial past, could be picked for a bigger purpose.
So it challenges the assumption that only like the good or the religious, can be used by God. It broadens the view of how divine intervention might work.
Exactly. And it lets people reconcile their support for Trump, even if they have reservations about him, with their belief in a divine plan. It's a way to make sense of his actions, even the ones that maybe clash with their values, by fitting them into this bigger story of redemption and purpose.
Okay, that makes sense with the Cyrus thing. But what about the other signs? How do they fit into this need for meaning and, making sense of things?
Let's take the Jerusalem embassy move, right? Controversial decision. But for those who buy into a certain interpretation of biblical prophecy, it wasn't just politics. It was a tangible sign that things were lining up with this divine timeline, bringing us closer to those ancient prophecies coming true.
Right, and we touched on how books like Ezekiel and Revelation, while complex and open to interpretation, paint these vivid pictures of Jerusalem's future, a city that holds huge symbolic weight for, Jews and Christians. Now, some interpretations focus on a literal end-of-the-world scenario, but others see it more symbolically, focusing on spiritual change or good overcoming evil.
That's it. And for those who lean towards that literal interpretation, Trump's actions with Jerusalem, whether recognizing it as the capital or those peace deals, become profoundly significant. It's like they're seeing prophecy play out right in front of them, validating their belief system and giving them purpose in a world that often feels chaotic.
I'm starting to see how these seemingly unrelated events can be woven into this coherent narrative that really speaks to those looking for those connections.
Exactly. It's about creating that sense of coherence, of meaning. It's a way of seeing the world through a specific lens that provides order and purpose.
Okay, but what about those who don't share these beliefs? What about people of other faiths, or those who don't believe in God at all? Where do they fit into this grand narrative?
That's a huge question, and this is where things can get a bit tricky. Some interpretations of these prophecies tend to zero in on a specific group, often defined as those who've accepted Jesus Christ as their Savior.
So for those who don't fit that category, it can feel like they're left out of this divine plan. Or even worse, that they're on the wrong side of, history.
That's the danger, and we need to be aware of that. When belief systems become too rigid or exclusive, they can fuel division, intolerance, even justify harmful actions. It's crucial to remember that even within Christianity, there's a spectrum of interpretations and beliefs. Not every Christian subscribes to these particular views on Trump or biblical prophecy.
Right. We got to avoid making generalizations about entire groups based on their faith.
Absolutely. It's about looking at these ideas critically, acknowledging how powerful belief systems are, but also seeing the diversity of interpretations and, the potential for those beliefs to be used in ways that are harmful or exclude others.
Speaking of harmful interpretations, I think we need to address the elephant in the room. Some critics argue that these beliefs about Trump and biblical prophecy aren't just wrong, but potentially dangerous. They worry that these beliefs could be used to justify, like authoritarianism, intolerance, or even violence.
That's a valid concern, and we can't ignore it. Throughout history, religious beliefs, even if sincere or well-intentioned, have been used to justify all kinds of terrible things.
Right, and I think it's so important to separate genuine faith from the manipulation of religion for political gain. We have to be on the lookout for those who might exploit these beliefs for their own agenda.
Exactly. It's about being able to tell the difference between authentic faith and those who twist it for their own purposes, and holding those in religious authority accountable for their actions and the impact of their words, on their followers.
Okay, so we've talked about the need for meaning, the power of belief systems, and the potential downsides of rigid interpretations. But what about the implications of these beliefs for society as a whole?
That's where things get really interesting. When a politician's actions are seen as divinely ordained, it can have a huge impact on political discourse and our ability to find common ground.
Like, we discussed Trump's pro-life policies and how some saw them as a divine mandate to protect the unborn. This brings up some tough questions. What happens when people see their political opponents not just as disagreeing, but as opposing God's will? Can you even have compromise or civil debate then?
That's the challenge, isn't it? When political beliefs get mixed up with religious convictions, it can create this sense of I'm absolutely right and you're absolutely wrong.
And that makes it super hard to find common ground or have a productive conversation.
Yeah.
It leads to polarization, demonizing the other side, and an unwillingness to even consider different viewpoints.
Precisely. And it's something we see happening all around us right now. It's a trend that goes beyond this whole Trump prophecy thing. We see it across the political spectrum, this tendency to view politics through a moral lens where compromise is betrayal and opponents are enemies.
So how do we navigate this increasingly polarized world? How do we have meaningful conversations about these complicated and sensitive issues without resorting to name-calling or just shutting down those who hold different views?
That's the million-dollar question. I think it starts with recognizing that even when we disagree, even when those disagreements come from deeply held beliefs, we're all human beings trying to make sense of things and live by our values.
It's about listening to each other, trying to understand where those beliefs come from, and finding that shared humanity that connects us even when we differ.
Exactly. And it's about developing empathy, being able to see the world from someone else's point of view, even if we don't agree with their conclusions.
That's a powerful message and one that's really needed right now. Now, before we wrap up this part of our deep dive, I want to shift gears for a sec and look at a different angle. We've talked a lot about the belief that Trump was chosen for a purpose, but what about the implications of him not being in office?
That's interesting. For those who believe he was divinely appointed, him leaving office raises a bunch of questions. Some might see it as a test of faith, a tough time before a triumphant return. Others might think his mission's done. He fulfilled his purpose, and now it's up to others to, carry on the work.
And some might even start questioning their initial beliefs, grappling with doubt and uncertainty as they try to square their faith with what's happening politically.
Right, and that's where the human side of faith shows up. It's not static, it's not set in stone. It's a process of questioning, seeking understanding, and wrestling with doubt as we go through life.
So even within this group of believers, there are different reactions and interpretations. It shows that faith isn't about blindly following rules, but about this ongoing search for truth and meaning.
Precisely. And I think that's important for all of us, no matter what we believe. Life's full of uncertainty and challenges. And how we face those challenges, how we deal with our doubts and seek understanding, that's what shapes who we are and how we engage with the world.
That's a deep thought, and I think it's a good place to, just keep listening for more.
All right, so we're back for the final part of our deep dive. We've been exploring these 7 signs, the ones some folks believe point to Donald Trump as this divinely chosen figure. And we've been unpacking, what these beliefs mean for people and society as a whole.
And like we've been saying, it's bigger than just one man or one political moment. It's about how we make sense of things, right? The stories we tell ourselves and how strongly we believe in them, especially in uncertain times.
Definitely. And doesn't it feel like we're living in extra uncertain times these days? We're constantly bombarded with info, often conflicting stories, all fighting for our attention. It's hard to know what to believe or who to trust. No doubt about it. And that's where the role of media and technology gets really important. How info spreads, the algorithms that decide what we see online, those echo chambers we get stuck in. It all shapes how we see reality and influences what we believe.
So true. And we see it happening with these 7 signs, too. These interpretations, the biblical prophecy connections, they're all over the internet, amplified by social media and some news outlets.
And it creates this, feedback loop, right? It makes those beliefs seem more widespread, more believable than they might actually be. It's something we see across the board, politically. Online spaces tend to amplify certain viewpoints, creating those echo chambers where people only see what confirms their existing beliefs.
So how do we escape those echo chambers? How can we be more critical of the information we take in, especially with topics as charged as religion and politics?
That's the tough part. It takes conscious effort, You got to seek out different perspectives, engage with stuff that challenges your assumptions, and be willing to question your own biases.
It's about understanding that nobody has all the answers. And even those who agree with you might see things a bit differently.
Exactly. And it's about being open to civil conversation, even with people you don't see eye to eye with. Respectful dialogue, it's crucial for a healthy society, especially in a democracy where different viewpoints are going to exist.
Okay, so we've covered media, critical thinking, and civil discourse. But let's zoom out even more. What does this all mean for the future of, faith and politics in the world?
Oh, that's a loaded question. No easy answers there. But I do think we're seeing this trend, this merging of faith and politics, where the lines between religious beliefs and political ideas are blurring.
You're right. We see it in the rise of religious nationalism, the influence of religious groups in elections and policy debates.
And that brings up some big questions. How do we handle this blending of faith and politics while also respecting religious freedom and that separation of church and state?
Yeah, it's a delicate balance. We want to protect people's right to practice their faith and participate in politics according to their beliefs, but we also have to guard against using religion to discriminate or force a specific set of values on others.
Exactly, and that takes ongoing conversation, willingness to hear each other out, and a commitment to finding common ground, even when we disagree.
It's about recognizing that we can have different beliefs, even very strong ones, without demonizing each other or dismissing those who see things differently.
Couldn't have said it better myself. And I think that's a powerful message to leave our listeners with. We've dug into some complex and maybe controversial ideas today, but at the end of the day, it's about encouraging critical thinking, respectful dialogue, and recognizing that shared humanity that connects us all.
Absolutely. So as we wrap up this deep dive, we'll leave you with one final thought to Ron. How do your own beliefs shape how you see the world and interact with others? What role do you think faith should play in public life? And how can we handle this increasingly complicated mix of faith and politics in a way that respects both individual beliefs and the common good? These are questions worth thinking about, and we hope you'll keep exploring them with an open mind and a willingness to have those thoughtful, respectful conversations.
And like always, stay curious, keep those questions coming, and never stop trying to better understand this world and the people in it.
Thanks for joining us on The Deep Dive. We'll catch you next time.